All right, today's presentation, Japanese art. Japanese art, of course, refers to the artistic stylings and creations that were made by the artists that were endemic to the islands of Japan. The art style itself by the Japanese is fairly unique considering the very little amount of outside influences, if you were, considering they were fairly sporadic over time. And because of the naturally xenophobic nature and the xenophobic geography of Japan itself, the art style itself would develop a very unique looking style. Although there are certain influences that could be drawn from Chinese and Korean style of arts later on, as we have here. Again, Japanese art, especially for the time period itself, is very distinct looking. And it's also important to note, this type of art that I'll be discussing here, this is the very unique style of art that Japan developed up until the early 1800s, in which case they were more or less opened up to the rest of the world. When was it used? There is a multitude of periods in Japanese art that more or less correlate with the cultural transition of Japan over time. Our first one is the Jomon. This is a very simplistic style of art, and this is representative of very early Japanese people living on the island. Yayoi is a period that saw an improvement in skills and techniques, and it also introduced the use of kilns and coppersmithing, as we have this bell here. The Kofun era, largely recognized as a continued development and improvement of yayoi techniques. As we see here, we have a clay figure, most likely used in a kiln. And then, of course, we have the Asuka and Nara period. This is where Buddhism and Korean cultures really took off in Japanese, and it really affected the Japanese style forward. And we have the Heian, a period that just simply saw a further development of Buddhist practice and influence in Japanese art. The Kamakura period, a shift in focus from the very exaggerated yet extravagant designs of previous Japanese pieces to the more realistic and practical designs. It's also a point in which calligraphy in Japanese art became much more important. Then we have the Muromachi period. It's a point at which Chinese culture is introduced and it heavily affects the area as well, influencing Japanese art. The Zuchi Momoyoya. Of course, this main change seen during this period was a focus on creating techniques that facilitate the demand for much larger, more detailed paintings, considering prior to this, most of what was made through Japanese art was much smaller, more refined pieces. And then we have the Edo period. This is the most modern period in which many artists, yes, very iconic image if you've seen it, they would create styles that would defy traditional normalities while also incorporating very earlier styles for the sake of creating very stylized designs. And of course, it also reflected the very restrictive policies of the Tokugawa shogunate at the time, considering much of the cultural influence of the time was largely restricted. And it's also at the point at which ukiyo-e wood prints, which are some of the most iconic of Japanese art, began to be developed. Yeah, this is also an Edo piece. This shows the very friendly negotiations the Japanese would have with other cultures once they began to adopt a Western tradition. Where is it? Well, surprisingly enough, Japanese art takes place on the island of Japan, which is made up of the islands of Hokkaido, Okinawa, Shukaku, Honshu, and Kyushu, funnily enough. And therefore, this part, really. Honestly, Japanese art doesn't exactly extend beyond that, beyond some minor trade, although much of this trade was largely restricted, or simply did not happen because of the naturally xenophobic nature of the Japanese people. Although you can see influences from Korea, the DPRK, China, and Russia in Japanese art considering close proximity. All right, who wants candy? Because of the deep ties art has with Japanese history, of course, one of the most important eras of Japanese history is a period of constant civil war and destruction that raged across the land. And this unstable period lasted from 1467 to 1615. So, what was the name of this era? No.
Okay. I don't know.
You're no help.
It's not B.
No. It is A, the Sengoku era, which just means constant war, weirdly enough. Here we have a piece from the Sengoku era. Very fun-looking time to be alive. Famous practitioners. Of course, famous practitioners, weirdly enough, despite the very uniform style Japanese art presented and the very xenophobic nature, we don't exactly have a lot of standout artists this time around, probably because it would be harder to break away from an art style if you had nothing really to draw on besides what was already there. Hence, we have people like Miyamoto Musashi, who, despite being a very famous artist at the time, was also better known as a philosopher and swordsman, considering he has the highest death count for swordship. Never lost a duel, won 60 of them, and he started at the age of 13. Very fun guy. He would also later become a philosopher and write the books of the Nitin Ichi Ryu, and they wrote The Five Rings. Pretty cool book. Here we have a piece in which, apparently, the name of it is Squirrel and Grapes. Very creative one, you know. Master philosopher and swordsman. What can you do? Then we have Katsushika Hokusai. Hokusai is a well-recognized Japanese artist, most famous for his piece of Mount Fuji. Although there is a number of pieces in which Mount Fuji is the center, the waves off of Kanagawa are obviously his most iconic. Very good marketing, I guess. And of course, his dedication to his craft was well known, considering he always strived for perfection, but it's also well known that at his deathbed, he said he was an awful artist and that it would take another 10 years to get actually good, I guess. And then, of course, we have Sesshu Toyo, who, despite being a very popular Japanese artist, is also well known for drawing upon much of the art of the Song dynasty of China. He's also well known for hating the modern Ming dynasty of China whenever he went to visit. Hence why he made a large rejection of many of those elements and focused on a blend of more Japanese and Song dynasty China elements, as presented here. Friendly negotiations. While Japan had previous interactions with the West, of course, the biggest one would be when Commodore Matthew Perry, under the guise of Millard Fillmore, president, by the way, if you didn't know who that was, in 1852, used what is known as gunboat diplomacy to open up Japan. Oh, this page is also important. What you had just saw was Isaac Newton, written in Japanese. Of course, it's important to note that the Dutch were the main people who were allowed to trade with the Japanese, especially considering the restrictions the Tokugawa shogunate would later place in the mid-1600s. Here we have a Japanese depiction of an American gunship. Again, this was the 1850s, so we had really taken off in the Industrial Revolution. Kind of a crazy design for a gunship, but whatever. There's Matthew Perry. Not that Matthew Perry, this one. Of course, once Japan buckled under the pressures of the gunboat diplomacy of America and many other countries like it, it would undergo a Meiji restoration in which it became much more modernized and rapidly westernized, if you would. Yeah, there we go. It's also important to note that this gunboat diplomacy, and at this point when America opens it up to the rest of the world, this is where we see Japan start to reflect its much more modern counterpart to it is now. Considering prior to this, the only major influences it would draw from the outside world was that of Buddhism and Chinese practices. And the historical significance. The main point to draw from this is that, again, art is a reflection of its people and allows us to study it in a much more interesting depth that writing just doesn't allow us to capture. It's also important to note that Japanese art stands as a very interesting look, considering it developed a wholly unique style that we rarely see around, considering the naturally xenophobic nature and the lack of actual interactions with other cultures that allowed it to develop. Similar to pre-Columbian art, it develops a style that is wholly iconic on its own and lacks any real counterpart that could be considered similar to it in a way. And of course, we have some paintings here. This is the first Tokugawa shogunate. There's Oda Nobunaga, Miyamoto Musashi, and Matthew Perry and his buddies. Again, Japanese art is very stylized, considering you may think to yourself, these don't look like humans, arguably. And you would be kind of right. And here we have our sources. Any questions? You candy if you ask a question.
Which source did you use more, Britannica or history?
Britannica.
Just put it on the board.
No. Wow, I can't even catch Reese's? Yes.
Looks like I told you to put it on the table.
Whatever. What you are so sad.
Do you think that in each of these separate cultures, like the Japanese and the English and the indigenous American people, do you think that they were completely isolated
It could be argued that way, and especially considering the fact that if left alone, a style could evolve to maintain a similar style, considering it's more or less a basis on the most archaic designs possible, but slowly evolved over time, thanks to not only a constant look for bettering a practice, but to also draw upon what little influences you do have. And the English present a rare example considering there were no exactly native English people that were living on the island in isolation prior to the Normans and the Picts and such. It was mainly just a largely uninhabited land. But yeah, South American people, for them, they present a very strange case in that considering the large amount of cultures there, and geography did pose a large means of restricting their travel, it would be theorized that over time they would eventually interact with one another and influence each other. The part about Japan is, on one hand, it's a very small place to begin with, and there's not many different cultures that could arise besides the Okinawan and Ryukyu peoples. And two, there were many reform movements throughout Japanese culture to unify the styles and to eliminate anything that would dissent it in order to maintain a cultural uniformity and prevent any insurrections. Any more questions?
I have another question.
Okay.
Why are the hands so small?
It's most likely for stylization purposes, considering not many professional artists existed in Japan, and a lot of it was self-taught or was simply